All right, so the last one we're going to talk about is continuity and discontinuity. This says, okay, those things that do change, how do they tend to change? Continuity is often expressed as being similar to the development of a tree or a plant. There's substantial change over time, right? But there's no real specific stage. It's a slow progression from seedling to tree, right? Whereas with something like insects, there are distinct stages, right, which indicate specific developmental time periods for the insect as opposed to the development of the seedling to the tree. Right? Most of the work in developmental psychology has focused on humans as being somewhat stage-driven. Erik Erikson, a very popular developmental theorist, viewed human beings as progressing through specific stages marked by conflicts and crisis between their psychological and social development. At each stage, we are faced with specific things that we must address to overcome, and if we fail to do so, these can create long-lasting effects. For example, in early childhood, we might have what's called the autonomy versus shame and doubt, which is when the child is beginning to learn to develop their own sort of control over their body, whether it's dressing themselves or toilet training. Right? This is an expression of autonomy that will serve them in terms of developing confidence and high self-esteem, whereas failure at this stage can often lead to issues of shame and doubt. As we progress through school age and into adolescence, we see issues between taking initiative, finding our place in the world versus developing a sense of inferiority. In adolescence, we see a lot of focus on developing identity. Young adulthood is about forming relationships. And as we get older, it's about sort of defining the value of our lives. Each of these is a distinct stage, very discontinuous development. And we see this again and again. Another stage-wise developist is Jean Piaget, who focuses on cognitive development rather than social and psychological development. He viewed the development of our cognitive abilities as occurring at very precise stages, right? To Piaget, for example, there's the sensory motor phase where our senses and motor systems have to develop before we can begin processing the world. There's the pre-operational phase, which is in early childhood, before about the age of 4, 5, or 6, where we tend to see the world in very illogical ways, right? This is prior to our ability to apply logic to the world. This leads to a very surface-level understanding about the way things are, right? And we can fundamentally change the properties of the world around us by changing, their appearance. The most famous example of this in Piaget is what's called conservation, which is where if you have two glasses that have the identical amount of liquid and you pour one of those glasses into a thinner glass, the liquid appears to rise higher because it's a thinner glass. We can logically say that the amount of liquid has not changed, but a child in this pre-operational phase will actually think that there's now more liquid in that glass. As we transition into logic, there's concrete operational, which is focused on the ability to use logic, but only in our concrete experiences. And lastly, sort of formal operational thought, when we can begin to reason hypothetically and abstractly. But again, a very stage-wise process. We can contrast this with someone like Lev Vygotsky, who viewed development as continuous rather than stage-wise. To Vygotsky, there is what's called the zone of proximal development. The zone of proximal development is the zone at which we are not able to do something without help, but with help we are able to do it. We would not want to focus our efforts teaching somebody something that they can already do without our help. Nor would we want to focus our efforts on trying to teach somebody something that they will not be able to do, even if they have our help. Instead, if we focus on that zone of development where, with our help, they are able to do it, we can teach them it until they master it and are able to do it without our help. And then what happens is, once they're able to master that thing that they can only do with our help, that zone of things that they would not be able to do even with our help now becomes the new zone of development, the new proximal zone of development, which are things that they can now do with our help. where each person is along this continuum is going to be dependent upon them. It's not really about stages, but about continuous development. So there's a big discussion in developmental psychology about, continuity and discontinuity, stability and change, and nature and nurture. And many of these things are not, necessarily in conflict, but represent different perspectives of different aspects of how we change over time.